Good morning. Welcome all. And thank you for joining Women's Way for our special virtual lecture on care work and the care economy. I know people are just joining in. I see the numbers increasing, which is a great thing to see. I'm Diane Corman-Levy, Chief Disruptor at Women's Way, and I'm delighted that you all decided to join us this morning. So while we wait for more folks to sign on, I would appreciate you taking the poll. We always want to know if this is your first time attending a Women's Way event. So if you could just answer that one question, we would greatly appreciate it. Thank you. So today's forum is actually, we added this special session in, but we consider it still part of our year-long series whose purpose is to educate different stakeholders about the drivers of the gender wealth gap and action steps each of us can take to help close the gender wealth gap. Since October 2020, when we started this series, we have conducted 26 forums that have addressed different drivers of the gender wealth gap, such as strengthening the early childhood education sector, decreasing gender and racial disparities in healthcare, increasing access to affordable housing, and eliminating the student debt crisis. Today's session is a special lecture by Dr. Nancy Folbre, who will discuss care work, which is the necessary but often invisible and undervalued engine that drives our economy. You will have opportunities to ask questions to Dr. Folbre via the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to address as many of your questions as possible. Closed captioning is enabled. If you do not want to see closed captioning, you can click Hide CC at the bottom of your screen. The chat is also enabled, so please share your comments during the session. We love to hear how you're responding to what you're hearing. And to create a safer space for all of us to engage in honest and challenging discussions, we ask each of you to abide to the session norms listed in the chat box. Finally, we will record the session and make it available for you to view again. And after the session, we will send you a list of resources related to today's topic. So before we hear from Dr. Folbre, which is why you're all here, I'm going to share just a few slides about Women's Way and the work we are doing to strengthen the care sector. In January of this year, we launched our new strategic plan which involved a new vision and mission statement. And this is really the world we want to see. This is what we dream of when we envision the future. And we love to see a region and beyond where caring and mutual support guide the decision that affects people's lives and where everyone, especially those historically impacted by gender inequities, has security, dignity, freedom, and joy. And this could look like the opportunity to grow a family and not sacrifice a career because all families have reliable care. And our mission statement, which is why we exist and how we achieve our vision, is we're here because we're working to achieve gender equity, and we're doing this by building collective power to disrupt oppressive systems while strengthening alternative models centered in love, dignity, and liberation. So today we're specifically going to be talking about the care economy. So what is the care economy? We are defining it as the work and relationships necessary for the health, welfare, maintenance, and protection of all people. It is the nurturing and reproduction of current and future populations. We also have concluded what's included in the care economy. We talk about it in relation to 5 dimensions: childcare, elder care, health care, domestic care, and disability care. And care work, as I said before, is the necessary but often invisible and undervalued engine that drives our economy, and women and other marginalized genders are predominantly holding up this work. The care economy has a huge impact on the ability of women and other marginalized genders to achieve economic security and to live with dignity, freedom, and peace. So understanding the link between the care sector and achieving gender equity, this year, we launched a new program called the Gender Economic Equity Program, thanks to a generous grant from Vanguard. And the goal of this program is to advance the efforts, knowledge, and impact of organizations in the care sector, working to strengthen innovative care models that are equitable, inclusive, and contribute to long-term social transformation. So how are we doing this? Well, over the next 3 years, we are working with these 4 wonderful organizations from the care sector: Along the Way, Connectively, Therapy Center of Philadelphia, and Women Count, also known as Women in Dialogue, to build their capacity to implement gender equity design into their internal infrastructure, processes, and work culture, and to gain a deeper understanding of how to strengthen care models that are inclusive and contribute to long-term social transformation. And we are building their capacity by investing $235,000 over 3 years in each of these organizations and providing opportunities for the grantees to engage in learning, exchange, and collaboration. So I'm going to hand this over to our amazing Kelly Sheard, who is our Chief Strategy Officer, who will serve as the moderator for today's session. Kelly.
Great. Thank you, Diane. And hello, everyone. Very exciting to have you here. I'm told that a great deal of you, about 60% of you that have joined us today, are first-time attendees. So we're extremely excited to have you here. If this is your first time with us, if you are an OG regular of this, welcome back. But I'm very excited. We're all very excited to introduce you to Dr. Nancy Folbre. And so I'll start by reading a bit of her bio and then invite her to join us on screen. So Nancy Folbre is a professor emerita of economics and director of the program on gender and care work at the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and a senior fellow of the Levy Economics Institute at Bard College in the US. Her research explores the interface between political economy and feminist theory, with a particular emphasis on the value of unpaid care work. In addition to numerous articles published in academic journals, she is the author of The Rise and Decline of Patriarchal Systems, the editor of For Love and Money, Care Work in the US, and the author of Greed, Lust, and Gender, A History of Economic Ideas, Valuing Children, Rethinking the Economics of the Family, and The Invisible Heart, Economics and Family Values. She's also written widely for a popular audience, including contributions to the New York Times Economics blog, The Nation, and The American Prospect. She is a co-curator of and regular contributor to the Care Talk blog at revaluingcare.org. So, welcome, Dr. Folbre.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. And I just want to start out by saying that my values and my goals are very much aligned with those of Women's Way. And as an economist, what I try to do is conduct research that can be empowering for activists and people in the community, and also to learn from activists and people in the community about what the important issues are for them and what research can do to help them out. I think the reality of the world that we live in is that economists have a lot of influence, and just taking basic ideas and framing them using an economics vocabulary can be strategically really useful. So that's part of my goal. I'm not so sure I'll tell anybody anything really new or surprising. Mostly want to kind of encourage you to think about it and to think about care work in terms of its contributions to the larger economy so that we can challenge the view that it's, not really all that important.
Fabulous. I think that is right up our alley. So this will be a very fruitful and productive conversation, and we're very happy to have you. I wanted to open actually and encourage folks in the chat and our audience to answer this question as well, which is to share your personal connection to care work. Meaning, if you are a giver, a receiver, if you are someone who works in a care work field, how are you connected to care work? And Dr. Fulbright, if you wouldn't mind answering as well, what is your personal connection to care?
Well, I'm not a parent, um, so I'm not connected to the parenting part of the care economy, but it's always fascinated me as a woman. Currently, I'm caring for my partner, who's 84 years old and has a very disabling and essentially permanent disease. And so I'm kind of learning to walk the walk along with talking the talk, which I think is what a lot of people are doing.
Yes, absolutely. Navigating the realities of that and how it shapes our lives. Thank you for sharing. And folks, I encourage you to share as well in the chat your own personal connection to care work. How are you coming at this? Giver, receiver, a little bit of both, someone who works in the field. And as they're doing that, Dr. Folbre, I'd like to get into some of our questions, which is just even just starting at the very top with how do you define care and why that particular definition?
I define care as the production, the development, and the maintenance of human capabilities for employment, um, for good citizenship, for being good neighbors, for being uh, uh, caregivers in their own right. Um, and the reason I use that word capabilities is that it's close to, but different from the term that economists use, which is human capital, which implies that somehow it's bankable or comparable to money in the bank, which I don't think is really a helpful analogy. And I think the term capabilities is broader, but it also really emphasizes the economic contribution that care workers are making.
Awesome. And for the folks who, much like myself, we do not study economics, we're not familiar with some of these terms. I'm going to ask questions so that you can sort of bring it down for us in terms of like, well, what do you mean by this? And let's start with a common definition. So even just this phrase of care economics, what do you mean by care economics? And is there something distinctive in the way that care work functions in the economy? What's care economics?
Care economics is an effort to kind of conceptualize what's distinctive about it, and also to show how it affects gender inequality, and also how it affects kind of the larger political alignments and shifting coalitions that we're experiencing today. So, what's really distinctive about it, especially from the point of view of an economist, is that it doesn't all take place in a market. It's not all about buying and selling. It's often about giving or share or kind of reciprocating or fulfilling a moral obligation or respecting an emotional connection. And in fact, these motivations are really crucial to effective care provision. It doesn't really work very well when it's driven entirely by considerations of monetary return. So even people who are working in relatively low wage care jobs typically take on a lot of concern for the people that they're caring for. And that's why it's so important that they be paid decent wages and that we enable them to develop continuous and long-term relationships with those that they're caring for. And one last thing, I'll come back to this again. I hope to make it kind of a consistent theme in what I'm talking about. Uh, it's really important to recognize the parallels between the natural environment, global climate change, pollution, things that we're concerned about in our natural environment, and to connect that with the social environment, the level of care that people are getting or not getting, the social costs of not providing adequate care. They're not really captured by the market or the market metric, but they're really crucial for the long run success of a market economy. And I think if we the more powerfully we can make that argument, I think the more allies we can get um, to support this vision of a more effective and equitable care economy.
That's so encouraging to hear you say. I think have had, I don't know, flashbacks of taking micro and macro econ in college, and everything was like charts and graphs and dollars and cents, and which is all important. But it's really interesting to think about the conversation outside of the bounds of sort of the value of what you buy and sell, and what you just mentioned about social care and social costs, that there are other considerations for us to have when we're talking about the care economy, which I think sort of makes it more accessible, I hope, for folks, if this is not your sort of main lane. So that's great to think about. Diane mentioned in one of the slides that the way that we think about care work, we talked about the five sectors: elder care, disability disability care, healthcare, childcare, and domestic care. And within those fields, people have said, those jobs are predominantly held by women. And so I'm curious, has care work always been women's work? Has that always been the case?
It's always been predominantly women's work. I think men have always been forced to step in when women were around, and I think that's still true today. But there's a lot less specialization in care today than there was uh, even 25 years ago. And I think that's one of the reasons that women are more empowered to actually fight effectively for more resources for care. Because the paradox is that while care provision is really crucial, really valuable, really productive, it's also disempowering. Because if you're saddled with responsibilities for caring for people who rely on you, you just have much less time, space, money, and bandwidth, right? To be politically engaged. So it's kind of a paradox that I think that uh, one of the reasons that we're doing better at fighting for better care is that we're spending less time doing specializing in it per se than we have in the past.
Oh, that's interesting. So does that mean we have sort of blended it into expectations, and so it is not seen as a separate and distinct function, and as the result of that, um, we're spending less time sort of defining or fighting for the rights or fighting for greater opportunities within that field because it's sort of getting like pushed into I'm thinking specifically for women that like the socialization concept around care is that it's sort of an outgrowth of what you do as an adult female, that like you have some sort of gene that predisposes you to it, that it's a part of becoming an adult, it's a natural thing, and so there's not a need to make this separate and distinct. It's just sort of an outgrowth of your function, particularly as a woman. Is that what you meant by the particular making this specific?
That plus something else. I mean, I think the cultural change is really important, and it's something that we participate in on an almost daily basis. I think there's a lot of kind of cultural bargaining going on about who should be doing care work and who should be paying for it. And
Mm,
uh, and I think it's a really fascinating process. But maybe because I'm an economist, I also think there are a lot of economic factors involved too, as well. And that,
mhm.
the logic of capitalism has been to pull women into wage employment, um, and to make it more costly, basically, to be a full-time caregiver, because
Mm.
it's just very disempowering in a market economy to be producing things of non-market value. So, uh, unfortunately, so in some ways, what that implies is that capitalist development has had some positive effects for women in terms of creating some new opportunities. But what's happened is it's gone to the other extreme. And so instead of having a system where women are forced to completely specialize in care provision, we're in this system where people don't get any reward or they're very much undercompensated for providing it. So it's sort of like, the devil versus the deep blue sea. And I think that's what a lot of care activists are, are, are pushing for as a way to achieve a better balance. So people have more choice and more flexibility in care provision, but we have an adequate supply because we respect and reward people who are providing care, which is hard
Yeah.
to have. Yeah.
Speaking of capitalism, I feel like in my lifetime, I have seen, or maybe just been more aware of critiques of capitalism, and I've seen a sort of greater push to not accept capitalism as a default way
Yeah.
that things need to be, which has been really interesting. And so I'm curious if capitalism and care work, how they influence each other, and if we would have the same challenges in the care economy as we would with other economic models.
Oh, it's such a big question. It's kind of scary, isn't it? Um, I guess I think that uh, capitalism is a really big word, and there are a lot of varieties of capitalism that are really not all that capitalist anymore. And so this is something that I think we're kind of struggling with. A lot of those old categories seem a little bit and outdated as a binary. We're seeing kind of more of a spectrum of economic systems uh, uh, and their relationship to the care economy. But I think almost every economic system uh, experiences some tension between short-run gains, like putting food on the table, and long-run gains, like making sure that people are taken care of and that there's a next generation to take our place. And I think that tension between those goals leads to some institutional changes that often lead to trying to reduce the cost of care provision by assigning it to women and not giving them many other alternatives outside of that. So I guess a really good example of that to me is what's going on in China right now, which is Chinese economic policy and social policy is very oriented towards maximizing economic growth and gross domestic product, even though it presents itself as a socialist state socialist nation that's oriented towards the well-being of its people. It's very slim on childcare and women's rights because it's so concerned to compete with capitalist nations on the economic growth spectrum, if you see what I mean. Whereas in Europe, you see some countries that are kind of moving in the different direction within a system that they call capitalist, but which is actually, in some ways, more supportive of care provision.
Dr. Folbre, I think I crashed out for a second with my internet. My internet was like slightly unstable. And so I'm hopeful that the audience heard most of what you said. I missed a little chunk of it, but I think if I'm remembering our previous conversations, you were talking about some of the Nordic countries and how they're right.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. And hopefully the audience got it. And it was just my strange internet. All right, thank you for your patience. Okay. I think that's interesting too. We were talking about the way that capitalism is functioning because it even is just, I think, a newer concept for me to just consider that there are economic models that don't necessarily emphasize competition over cooperation, and that there are different ways of organizing how we are exchanging goods and services and how we're working together, that it doesn't have to be this way. Pros and cons, and like you're mentioning, short-term tensions and long-term
Yeah.
gains, but there are different ways that people are conceptualizing this and making this work. And we've got some models in different countries that are worth looking at. So good to think about. Thinking about your field, thinking about other economists, how do economists view care work? What do they get right and what is missing?
Well, economists like to disagree a lot about a lot of things, including care work. So I can't speak for all economists, but I'm part of a kind of uh, disruptive group of economists that is really arguing that we should see care provision as a real contribution to our standard of living and our economic sustainability, and that's why we should support it. And I would say the mainstream economic position is the exact opposite of that. It describes care provision as something people do because it makes them feel good, it makes them happy, and there's no point trying to put a dollar value on it, or you can't worry about it being underpaid because people, after all, they wouldn't do it unless they felt like it was worth doing. So they must be getting enough satisfaction to be compensated fully for it. That's kind of a wicked, um, you know, stereotype that I'm giving you there, but I think it holds pretty true if you look at basic economics textbooks. Care is considered like a form of leisure.
Leisure. Oh my. That is definitely not the word I think of when I think of parenting labor. Leisure.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
right, right.
Hmm. Fascinating. Okay. So then how do economists in your field, and I love, by the way, that the field that you mentioned, the feminist economist, that you conceptualize yourself as disruptors, that feels very aligned. Uh, how do economists in your field a study, how do they understand gender inequalities? Is it a side effect of a market failure or is it something else? Like, why do these things happen?
Yeah, it's a lot of things. Uh, and I think the complexity of it is what makes it, I think, so interesting. So we know that a big part of it is discrimination, and we have pretty strong evidence historically and in the present day of discrimination against women and against mothers in particular in the labor market. Uh, we also have a lot of evidence about the evolution of patriarchal institutions that reduce the bargaining
Mhm.
power of women in the market. So employers don't have to explicitly discriminate if uh, their firm is embedded in a larger set of institutions that limit women's choices per se. But what we've seen, and I think this is very much a product of, what's happened in the last 30 years, is that even when women enter into better paying jobs, women have really made progress in terms of getting college degrees and entering professional and managerial jobs, but they're often very much concentrated in uh, care industries like health, education, and social services that pay significantly less than other industries, all else, um, all else equal. So another factor, of course, is that women are often women who have children face this real difficulty of combining childcare and paid work. And so now it seems like the care responsibilities are probably an even more important determinant of gender inequality than they have been in the past. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's become a catchword that people are really interested in using and thinking about and conceptualizing more clearly.
You know what? Something you mentioned in the earlier part of your answer, which was that firms don't need to be explicit with their discrimination if they are embedded in institutions that have structural biases, I think is a really important one for us to think about, which to me, I'm thinking you don't need to be on the face sort of targeting and or creating barriers in order to be contributing to the problem if you're embedded in an institution
Yeah.
that has sort of um, got that sort of embedded in it. So that's really interesting to me. Um, and I just want to emphasize for folks in the chat, seeing lots of comments in the chat, which is wonderful. And if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Dr. Folbre, to put them in the Q&A. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll either see the Q&A box or you'll see a circle that says more with 3 dots, and then you'll see Q&A in there. So add your questions there because I'll get to them at the end. I'll be sure to elevate them and make sure that they're addressed. So use the Q&A. Um,
Can
so
I
a question, yes,
can I give you I think a really good example of a institutional factor that perpetuates gender inequality without employers
please
really.
do, please do.
Okay. When employers have the right to ask job applicants what their salary was in their previous job, that always puts women at a disadvantage because they start out in lower paying jobs. And the employer isn't discriminating, they're just being economically rational to say, oh, well, I don't have to pay you very much more than you earned in your last job. And so that dynamic is one of the dynamics that's reproduced differences in wages between women and men. And that situation is worsened when firms punish employees who report what they're earning. Because if women learn what their male counterparts are earning, then they're more likely to go back and uh, bargain for higher wages, right? But it's often, they're often threatened with sanctions if they reveal their salary to other workers because of this kind of bargaining power dynamic.
Oh, that's interesting. That makes me think of conversations we've been having with the Forum for Executive Women around pay equity and pay transparency laws and the ways in which they're sort of advocating for how you talk about and where you share your pay and how that influences what opportunities are available to you. But I hadn't thought about the fact that folks are sanctioned for sharing that and that there's a real sort of cost to what could be, attempting to have some transparency, but folks are not experiencing greater access in that way. That's interesting. So switching gears a little bit, and I'd love to hear also from folks in the chat how you might answer this question. But why do you think it's so difficult for people to access and afford care services for their loved ones? And then part two of that is, does it feel possible or likely to you that we can influence institutions to address this?
Well, yes. Um, I'm just trying to think about like the best way to frame this. Um, just say again, what's the most important part of that question for you?
Why do you think it's so important, or why is it so
Why does it
difficult,
cost so much?
rather,
Okay.
yeah, to access and afford care services? Like,
I,
why has this become
yeah,
so expensive?
I've really been struggling about this in my research, and it's really it's hard. It's kind of a hard question to answer. It's very clear that the price of care services has been going up more rapidly than other prices. And in
Mm,
fact, the increase is really understated if you look at the data on price increases, because what happens is that a lot of people just get priced out of the market. So it's not just that childcare and elder care cost more, it's that a lot of people just can't buy them anymore because they're so expensive relative to the salaries that they earn. And, part of that has to do with the fact that earnings growth has been pretty slow at the bottom of the economy. But it also has to do with the fact that care workers, employers have to pay care workers enough to get them to take a care job rather than another job. Okay. So now there are a lot of jobs outside of the care sector as well as in the care sector. Okay. And if you know how people think about a job, there are certain things they care about.
mhm.
They often want to do something that they feel a calling for or some connection to, but they also have to pay their bills, right? So if they can earn a lot more in a non-care job, that means they have to earn higher wages in the care job. And that is one of the things that makes it, even though elder care and childcare workers are paid very low wages relative to other workers, they're still earning just enough to pull them into that sector out of a sense of commitment and calling to it, right?
Mm.
But they start leaving if they can't and turning over and going into other jobs if they're not earning enough to pay their bills. Okay. So wages do rise in care jobs, and it's a very labor intensive sector. When wages go up, what that means is when wages go up, the prices have to go up too, because wages are the major cost of providing those services. So um, it used to be said, economists used to think that this was a problem with the service sector in general compared to manufacturing, but now there's a lot of research that suggests that it's very much kind of focused on this dynamic on the care sector per se.
That is fascinating. I'm seeing some folks in the chat who have their own sort of takes and opinions, which we love. Please put your questions in the Q&A box. We can be sure to address it. And I know tons of folks have experience with thinking about why things have gotten more expensive. It's really interesting to me that you said it's gotten, like the price of care services has gotten more expensive relative to other
Yeah,
things. I remember when I was a child, the way that I was cared for before I went to school, there was a retired woman on the street who, not on the street, on the block, who used to watch people's kids, and her name was Grandma Everett. And, I think my mom and dad paid something nominal, and she took in kids and like watched them
yeah,
during the day. And that's what I did until I was 5. And then that was not the case. There was no Grandma Everett when I had a child and I needed to return to work. There was daycare with prices that were just astronomical, and I went into debt in order to have my child in child care so that I could work. So it was just a huge cycle for me that really didn't ease until he got into public school. And it's, unfortunate that I had to think of it that way, that like, oh God, I can't wait until he turns 5 and can
Yeah,
go to school because I just can't afford childcare. Like I
yeah.
cannot afford it. But it's a reality for so many folks. And that's just one example for childcare. But that burden doesn't necessarily ease if you're thinking about elder care. There is no, I just have to wait until this time and then something will open up. That's not often the case there. Um, so
There's
switch.
also, I was going to just add
Yes.
one thing in, which is, there's also a lot more potential for technical innovation outside of the care sector. Um, that is,
What does
like
that mean?
here's what it means. Here's what it means. Well, take parking lot attendants. Um, um, uh, for a long time, it's been considered that for a long time there were comparisons made between the earnings of childcare workers and parking lot attendants. And
Okay.
the great paradox was that parking lot attendants have always earned a lot, well, not a lot, but significantly more than childcare workers, right? Which is an example of the real devaluation of childcare workers' wages. But now what's happening is that parking lot attendants' jobs are disappearing because a lot of parking is being basically automated with an app on your phone, right? So the parking lot attendants that remain are higher paid, but there are fewer parking lot attendants. So
Oh, that's interesting.
it's becoming a much less labor intensive industry because it can be automated, right? Or think about retail, a lot of retail, we used to think of retail clerk jobs as being a kind of, labor intensive job. You have to pay a lot to have the salespeople on the floor. But now a lot of that is now online and kind of automated ordering and packaging and shipping that's decreasing the costs of manufactured goods and the delivery of manufactured goods, but services are harder to automate. Now, I mean, there's some automation taking place, like Zoom itself is an example of something that is making some aspects of care work more productive, like the conversation we're having right now. But it hasn't increased, that technological change hasn't been as rapid in care jobs, and by definition, because a lot of care jobs require a personal connection.
I was just thinking that because I wonder if that's even
Yeah,
where we would want to go to have care work to be automated. If you're thinking about your loved one, your neighbor, your auntie, like would you want it to be? We have these self-driving cars and the self-checkout. Would you want automated care services. And so I can see both. I can see where perhaps in certain functions, that
yeah,
sort of technological
yeah,
automation could be helpful. But the bulk of this, you do want a person, a personal touch, a human care. And so there isn't the potential for that to solely be done by robots. I would hope, oh gosh, we'll see. Stay tuned. Um, so switching gears just a little bit, just talking about where we are sort of in our political context. Under the Trump administration, the Department of Labor is halting enforcement of minimum wage and overtime rights for home care workers. Historically, how have you seen workers respond to these challenges, and how should we be supporting their efforts?
There's such a long and interesting history of workers overcoming divisions among themselves to bargain for better working conditions and better social policy. And it's always been an up and down, advance, retreat, advance, retreat. And I think that's what we're going through right now. We saw some pretty significant advances, especially under the Obama administration, with some rights for domestic workers, and the Department of Labor agreed to cover home care workers, um, to protect them from, to guarantee that they would earn at least a minimum wage and get overtime for work beyond a certain uh, hourly limit. And then, but of course, that imposes costs that are very tangible on taxpayers. And so it became a part of a whole kind of rollback of social services and of a whole attack on the care economy that's been a central feature of the current administration. So you asked me how we fight back against that, and that's the really tough question. And I'm hoping some people here will have some really great ideas. I guess I feel like what I'm trying to do, what my personal strategy is I'm just trying to do more um, explanation of how this damage to the care economy is going to hurt everybody, and it's in everybody's economic interests actually to think about more public investment in it, and trying to figure out how to get that word out beyond, beyond the ivory tower in every way possible. So
Oh, that
hopefully
is
this is some
music
help.
to my ears.
Yeah,
Yes, yes, from beyond the ivory tower. Yeah, I think that it's really important that you help provide the context and help sort of explain some of this for folks who are looking to think of, well, okay, well, what's the right way, for instance, to support workers who are facing these threats, or how should we be even thinking or talking about this within our fields to sort of have some collective power around disrupting what is in fact a crisis. So I think your intent and your impact are matching here, and I appreciate that. And I think the folks in the chat are agreeing because I'm seeing tons of comments and tons of questions as well, which I will
great.
turn to now.
Okay.
So Samantha Porter, hi Sam, wants to know, I'm also curious about the way we understand capitalism without the treatment of externalities and the limits to growth. Ooh, we are giving very technical phrases here. How we're understanding capitalism without the treatment of externalities and the limits to growth. What does that mean?
This is a really great point, and it's kind of reaching for what I was kind of um, playing around with at some points in my uh, in my talk. I mean, economists talk call externalities anything that's external to the market, anything that doesn't have a dollar sign, a price tag on it, right? So
Mhm. Okay.
even basic economics texts admit that there are externalities. How can you deny it? Because for one thing, the climate crisis and our whole concern about um, species extinction and pollution and health impacts, et cetera, those are all externalities, right? So they're
Okay.
admitted, but they're always treated like, oh, this is kind of a minor detail, or this is kind of an inconvenience, or oh, we can deal with this. If we just grow fast enough and make more money, we can compensate people for the harms they may experience. And I think, what I try to do in my work is show that the externalities are actually bigger. The dollar value of the externalities is actually much bigger than the dollar value of what's bought and sold in the market. Uh, right? If you think about, what's the value of a human life? And, what would people pay for another 5 years of life expectancy, right? Um, so to me, in fact, the real crisis of capitalism is externalities uh, that are really basically biting it in the butt. Uh, and of course, it's a gradual process and it's kind of looming in the future. It's not like affecting us like in a super dramatic way right now, but it's already evident in terms of just a lot of things like uh, the combination of climate emergencies, the difficulty of getting insurance, house insurance for people who are living in areas that are prone to natural disasters, more fires, rising temperatures. I just read an article in the New York Times the other day about the high levels of heat in Texas, dividing people into two groups, the cooled and the cooked. I mean, literally,
Ooh.
isn't that terrible? Literally, people working in outside in, like tending a barbecue pit in Texas are experiencing such high rates of heat exhaustion that eh, they're falling over, literally. And I think a lot of our social climate is also characterized by, a lot of polemic, a lot of misinformation, a lot of kind of really violent threats, and it's kind of there are a lot of ways in which our social climate is just really heating up and in ways that are really affecting all of us.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you sort of phrase it. Economists or some economists might have treated these externalities as like an unfortunate side effect or a
Yeah.
thing that like will eventually grow so large that we'll be able to, pay for it or in other words, innovate out of
Yeah.
this thing that we're just temporarily experiencing. But in the meantime, folks are dying and we're on fire. So it's, I don't know if
I
that
like the way
framework is
I like the way you
helping
put that.
us.
That was great.
It was a little bit of a downer, Nancy, but yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, yeah.
Um, Okay, so Lisa would like, and I think we addressed some of this, but I wonder if maybe you have more to say. Could you talk a bit about how the current administration's threats to workforce protections are happening and ways that we can ensure job protections for care workers are treated fairly in accordance with labor laws? So I know we mentioned the threats to the healthcare workers, but are there other threats to workforce protections
Yeah,
that you're
they're all over
seeing?
the map. They're all over the map. And I think really what we need to do is we need to push the Democratic Party to take a more upfront stand for labor protections, and then we need to try to get them elected. That's really the only thing that we can do because all of these changes are being imposed from the top down by executive power, and that executive power depends on congressional, at least to some extent. I mean, it's shocking how little, but at least to some extent depends on congressional approval. So, our
Mm.
immediate goal should be to think about the midterms and what kinds of politicians we can elect that can hold the fort, uh, because that it's a really important fort.
Yeah, I've heard some folks, there's this movement called Your Seat Ain't Safe, which means that folks who are currently sitting in elected
Yeah.
official positions, that they should not take for granted that they will remain there. And
Uh,
it's sort of a drive and push for folks to be more explicit and aggressive, I think, about clarifying the values that we want to be operating on and the changes that we'd like to see. And so, like looking at everybody, that your seat ain't safe, and looking to the midterms is a key way to enact that. Joe, oh, yes,
I just want to add
yes,
one
yes.
thing. Uh, the federal level is really important, but the state level is also really important. And I think what we're going to see in the next few years is a real divergence between public policies in blue states and public policies in red states. And it's really important for people to keep that in mind, that is also a really important line of attack.
Got it. Don't just think federally, think about state politics and local as well to the degree
Yeah,
that we can.
yeah.
Got you. So another question here, the shortage in care provision could be alleviated by adopting a more open immigration policy, which has been rare recently in the US, as migrant workers can help address labor supply shortages. Many Asian countries, such as Taiwan and Hong Kong, benefit from the influx of Filipino female workers. However, what potential downsides might this approach entail from your foresight?
Well, we can't and shouldn't encourage immigration without providing much better protections for immigrant workers. Uh, That's just the bottom line. And I wish I could point to some countries that were could serve as a really good model in that respect. Unfortunately, I can't. Canada is a little bit better than the US in that respect, but I think this is an area that people should really be thinking about is how to design a better immigration policy that both uh, provides opportunities and respects workers' rights and helps us provide the care that we need.
Yeah, I appreciate that, that it's, that there could be an answer in terms of labor supply shortages, but once people are here, we also need to think about their protections, their access to opportunities, and their quality of life, and not just to fulfill
Yeah,
a need, but how are they able to live and be here?
yeah.
Important. Jill wants to know, what would it take to change labor, work, or family policies to link benefits and part-time pay? So much holds caregivers back economically if they don't want to outsource parenting via daycare or paid help,
Yeah.
but also do not want to have to work full time, 37 and a half or 40 hours a week. But we absolutely need to value parenting by all genders and make it possible economically for part-time workers to have access to equal pay for equal value jobs and benefits. How do we lobby for that?
I think that's such a great point, and I think improving the quality of part-time jobs is really key because um, as important as public services are, people also need more flexibility for themselves and their personal circumstances to be able to uh, work fewer hours than the kind of standard work week, which, by the way, it keeps getting longer and longer in terms of hours. So um, the I think one really clear demand that we could be making is that companies should be legally required to prorate benefits. That is,
Ooh.
if somebody's working 20 hours a week instead of 40 hours a week, they should be getting at least, at the very least, half the value of the benefits. Right now, what happens is if they're below 30 hours, typically they're not eligible for benefits at all and they can be excluded. And in fact, what we see now is that benefits, including work family benefits, are really restricted to the kind of upper echelon of wage
Mm.
earners. And it's another example of a kind of divide and conquer strategy that's made it difficult um, to push for reform. So I think being mindful of that division and pushing for expansion of right to employee benefits. That's clearly got to be one part of the strategy. But another, of course, is to push for more public services and public funding of services um, that makes it easier for people to work the hours that they would actually really choose. So somehow we've got to walk on both those legs.
Thank you for that. Utara wants to know, in India, where the supply of surplus cheap labor enables middle and upper class families to outsource much routine care work, how do cultural norms and concerns about social reputation, for example, what will people say, impact mothers' choices to retain direct involvement in certain caregiving tasks, despite access to paid help? The second part of that question is how can economic models account for the interplay between labor market dynamics and non-market social constraints in explaining intra-household care work allocation? Ooh, that is meaty. That's a meaty one,
Yeah.
Nancy. What do you think of this one?
Well, I think that's a really important and very sophisticated question. And there is some research that's happening trying to understand the impact of cultural norms and economic circumstances. And I'll just give you an example. Looking at uh, uh, immigrants to the US, some of them are coming from countries with a high rate of women's participation in paid employment, and some from countries with a low rate of participation in paid employment. And they continue to those that cultural heritage continues to affect the participation patterns of their children. So it's clearly a norm that's passed down, but it also tends to diminish over time. So I think the way to understand cultural norms is that they often resist economic incentives, but they're often also kind of gradually attenuated or weakened by them. And I think also it's really interesting to think about cultural norms as something that people are bargaining over. You know, it's sort of it's not an open discussion like, you know, raise your hand if you think that uh, fathers should raise your hand if you think fathers should participate equally in child rearing in the US. It's more this kind of implicit bargaining, like how often do you see a man in public with a child? How often do you see men uh, in featured culturally in films or elsewhere playing you know, providing care and playing a caring role? And I think actually a lot of our culture is a little bit on the leading edge, which is why, you know, conservatives have been so angry at Hollywood. Um, and the quote unquote Hollywood elite is precisely, you know, for that reason. So, uh, Yeah, so I think a lot remains to be done there. I think it's kind of an new and open field to think about how do we go about challenging norms, um, and you know, not just saying no to them, but just saying, well, why not? Why don't we try this? Or have you thought about that? Or
Mhm.
let's have some diversity here. Let's encourage some experimentation here. Let's be open to doing things differently than we have in the past. And I think that's something that we're all engaged in on kind of a daily basis in one way or another.
Yeah. Living in in the nuance, asking
Yeah.
better questions, trying slightly different things. What else could be possible? Sort
Yeah.
of like the edge there of some of these things. Oh my goodness, look at the time. I'm going to take one more question from the audience and then I'll wrap us with a question. See, that flew by, Nancy, that flew by. Okay, so Renee would like to know, how do we take care of and or advocate for workers who are impacted by the fiscal cliff? What if they work more but are ineligible for public assistance? How might we think of supporting those workers?
Wow, that's so important. I'm really glad that got brought up. The way that people lose eligibility for assistance when they earn more money, it's basically a tax, and it's a really high tax, and it affects low income families. So it's a much higher tax on their income than the ultra wealthy pay on theirs. I mean, it's really pretty shocking. And I think one of the reasons people don't know about it or don't talk about it as much as they should is it's pretty complicated, right, to make the calculations. In fact, a lot of people don't even know ahead of time, like, uh-oh, if I take on some extra hours, how is that going to affect my eligibility? It, it
Yeah.
it's hard to even know. And I think it's a real downside of the whole means tested benefit system in the US, and it's a reason that we should be arguing for universal benefits.
Mm.
This is a bigger argument, but it's a good one to end with because looking forward, I think we should see public care services as a right, part of our, it's a right of social reproduction. It's a right to reproduce ourselves and to take care of ourselves that we should fight for uh, in the public arena. Um, so let's go for it.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, we're certainly thinking about the connection between the care economy and the social safety net. And as an organization, we'll be focusing more on that in our advocacy work and our closing the gender wealth gap work. And of course, at our Gender Wealth Summit, we'll be talking about the social safety net, what can be done to protect it and strengthen it, and that'll
Uh,
take place September 26th. So love that we ended in that way. Nancy, I would love to just hear one or two thoughts as a closing that you would like to share with us. Any final thoughts or takeaways that you'd like to offer to the audience about care work, the care economy, and how we might think about the way forward.
I feel like I've kind of said pretty much what I can say, but I want to reassure the people who post a lot of really good comments and questions that I'm going to read every single one of them and think about them. And I hope we'll have another opportunity for some back and forth because it's really important to keep us in this process of thinking strategically about the care economy.
Agree, agree. There's so much more to say, so much more to ask, so much more to talk about. But I really, really appreciate you taking your time and offering your expertise with the topic. We know care work and the care economy is so important for us to consider as we're thinking about the liberatory economy that we want to build. And we're really lucky to have you for this deep dive. So thank you, Dr. Nancy Folbre, for joining us.
And thank you for
And
all the great
for
work you're doing. Yay.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And for participants, all the folks who were in the chat and offering your questions in the Q&A, we so appreciate your rich engagement with this. And thank you for joining us. The recording will be sent out to all of you who are on this call, along with some readings related to the topic and some that Nancy has provided for us. Thank you there. Make sure, as I mentioned, that you join us on September 26th for the Gender Wealth Summit, where we'll explore the social safety net, what it will take to protect it and strengthen it. The link to register is on our website, it's on social media, and it's also in the chat. So we will see you again on September 26th at the Gender Wealth Summit. Thank you again, Nancy, for joining us, and everyone have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.